Are you ready? Great. So thanks for coming, everybody. My name is William George, and I'm a researcher for the Kleros Cooperative. So today I'm going to be talking about parameterization of cryptoeconomic systems. And a lot of what I'm going to say is informed by the research I've done for the parameterizing the parameters of Kleros. So I'll briefly introduce that and use it as a sort of running example. I hope to pull in some other examples and draw some general themes. So Kleros, if you're not familiar, is a blockchain-based dispute resolution platform. And the idea is that imagine you have two parties that have some business relationship, Alice and Bob. Alice is like a small business owner, Bob is a freelancer. And instead of going to signing a traditional contract and going to a traditional court or traditional arbitration if they have a dispute, instead what they do is when they start their sort of work together, Alice puts the payment that would be paid to Bob into an escrow on a smart contract. And if ever there's a dispute, if there's no dispute, then Alice just clicks a button saying release payment to Bob. But if there is a dispute, then you use crowdsourcing with the Kleros platform, where a certain number of users of Kleros are randomly drawn, and they will judge your dispute. And they do so in a way that's sort of incentivized and organized using a game theoretic principle that's called a Schelling point, or focal point. This is an idea that was introduced by Thomas Schelling. He went on to win the Nobel Prize in economics. And the idea is that if people are trying to coordinate, in the absence of communication, they tend to coordinate around solutions that seem sort of special or natural somehow. So a famous example that Schelling had was that if you have two people that are trying to meet in a given city at a given time, and they know or a given city on a given day, but they don't know exactly where and they don't know exactly when, where will they go? Well, they tend to meet at a famous landmark. So in Paris, if I had two people that were trying to meet somewhere but they didn't know exactly where, they might go both stand under the Eiffel Tower. And at what time? Well, maybe noon, because noon is a distinguished time. The Eiffel Tower is a distinguished place. Anywhere else would have worked, but people sort of gravitate toward these natural special solutions. And then in Kleros, the idea is that sort of honest rulings of disputes should be focal points, should be Schelling points that people will gravitate around. So the different jurors are incentivized to sort of agree with the consensus of other jurors. And then if you're a given juror, you think, okay, I'm reading the case, I'm looking at the evidence, I think Alice has a better argument. I think the other jurors are also going to think that Alice has a better argument. So I'm going to vote for Alice, expecting everybody else to vote for Alice. Okay, so with that sort of introduction out of the way, what parameters would one choose in such a system? And how? What would go into your choice of parameters? So there's some really obvious choices, there's a per juror fee, an amount of compensation that jurors need to be given to compensate them for their dispute resolution work. That could vary, higher or lower. Jurors can have to put a stake that can be lost if they're ruled to be incoherent with sort of the community consensus on a case. There's a notion of appeals in Kleros, so there are a number of parameters around that. Particularly, there's a parameter that determines how many times you can appeal before the system sort of stops. There are lengths of periods, how long one has to submit evidence, how long you have to vote, etc. And what does this sort of parameterization process look like now? Well, it looks like a parameterization in a lot of other DAOs. And there's a forum, and people post things in a forum, and then maybe people vote on snapshots. I post a lot of parameters in the forum, but other people do sometimes too, in posts that kind of look like this. And I'm going to talk about, over the course of the talk, how one chooses parameters, how one could choose parameters, and sort of what things to keep in mind. And a running theme is going to be around attack resistance to your parameters being manipulated. So for this governance model, which Kleros uses and many DAOs use similar things for their parameter choices, this sort of security model that keep in mind to compare to the other potential models is that no participant should control more than 50% of the tokens that are voting on a given parameter update. Because if you could, if one party could control the vote, you can imagine them putting malicious parameters into place. They set all the periods to 0 or something, so that when a case comes up, no one has time to vote or something like that. And it's interesting to note that in Kleros, that security model is also sort of the security model of the system itself, the dispute resolution game. And that the way in Kleros that sort of people are choosing to act as dispute resolvers is that they stake a token, and then a random token is selected, and if you have that token, you can vote on a dispute. And this is done so that the system is Sybil resistant. If I have someone that would try to create like a lot of fake identities to get disproportionate voting weight, they can split their tokens over as many addresses as they want, they're still going to have the same voting weight. So by having this kind of token-weighted voting, you don't allow for someone to get disproportionate weight by having like fake addresses. And note that because there's this notion of appeal, that you control larger and larger panels of jurors, that if you get like a really large panel of jurors that's very sort of statistically representative of the community, your odds of getting more than half the votes on that panel is, are basically like you will get more than half of the votes if and only if you have more than 50% of the stake, sort of by the law of large numbers. Okay, so similarly, the security model of the dispute resolution game is that no participant should control more than 50% of the stake. So it's convenient that like this sort of governance in the game itself has the same security model because you've kind of reduced your attack like surface. You only have like one thing you need to assume. Okay, but like now zooming back out and being a little more philosophical and comparing maybe to some other systems, you might ask, okay, like it's great that the governance attack sort of security model is the same as the system, but why have parameters at all? Like if I could just like avoid having parameters, I wouldn't have to worry about attacks where people maliciously change the parameters. So this sort of gets to like a principle of governance minimization that could be approached in several different ways. And so like a first idea would be to say, okay, well, maybe I'll just redeploy the contract with each set of new parameters that users would want to use. If somebody thinks that the fee for a task should be X, they deploy a version of the contract. Somebody else thinks a fee should be Y, they just deploy a different version of the contract. And then parties can decide which ones they want to use, jurors decide which contracts they want to work on, which have the most appealing fees. And the problem with this is that each contract wouldn't be very resistant 51% attacks. Someone could come along and, you know, like on a contract that only has like a few people staked on it, it doesn't take very much to like stake more than the people who would be there and to take control of that contract. So your system is kind of fragmented, and the weakest link isn't very strong. And in a similar kind of analogous situation, you wouldn't want a lot of copies of a DeFi protocol because you would split up liquidity. So in both cases, you have kind of network effects. In the sort of Kleros example, you have this network effect that if everyone is staked in the same place, that place is stronger than lots of different, separate courts would be, because in order to 51% attack like a single court, you'd need more resources than a lot of fragmented courts. Okay, so that idea is not very useful. It's like a very powerful and like ideal situation if you have a cryptoeconomic system that has like no network effects, but it's not very useful for most of the systems we actually have. So like idea 2. Maybe I'll just have parameters that auto-adjust to the market. My like fees that jurors receive will just like auto-adjust. Maybe, for example, each user can set a price at which they're willing to be a juror for a task, and then I'll just take the cheapest juror for each task. It's a very free market solution. We believe in free markets. So like, you just sort of let economics determine what the values in your system should be. And a problem with this, at least for this particular approach in the context of Kleros, would be that you can imagine that like if I have an outsider, like someone who has a vested interest in one of the cases, that maybe they're one of the parties to a dispute, if they see their case is going to come up soon, maybe they just set their like threshold for what they're willing to work really, really low, so that they will be drawn and other people won't be drawn. And like this, you wind up drawing disproportionately people who are hostile, that were willing to set sort of artificially low prices, and they can take over the court on a given task. Okay, so that's not great. So maybe like a less naive approach would be that each user sets a price where they're willing to work, but then the parties to the dispute set a threshold price that they're willing to pay. And then you randomly draw from among the users whose price is below the threshold. So this works better, and it works pretty well if the parties set good thresholds. If the threshold set by the parties is high enough that you draw in a wide pool of jurors, then you'll get maybe there'll be a few honest jurors who are set unrealistically low prices, but if your pool of people has a good percentage of honest jurors in it, you're more likely to get them anyway. When it's a problem is maybe the parties think, okay, I'm going to set like a low price because I'm going to try to like drive a hard bargain with Kleros. I'm going to try to get like affordable dispute resolution by setting like a very aggressive price. And by setting such an aggressive price, they could price out all of the honest jurors so that they're only left with the dishonest people who are trying to like maliciously attack the system. So that's not amazing, particularly because you would hope like in designing, like doing research on Kleros, we want Kleros to sort of act like a black box. where people with disputes can just sort of plug this into their system without thinking too much about how it works. You don't want them to have to like worry that like about what threshold they're going to set. And moreover, you can imagine having a situation where like the two parties to a dispute have sort of asymmetrical knowledge about how Kleros works, and maybe one of them sets like proposes setting like a low threshold, knowing that it will drive out most honest dispute resolvers. They'll wind up with dishonest people who could favor them, and then the other party could be taken advantage of. So that's not very good either. And then ultimately, what's sort of like, I think the philosophical point to take away from this is you don't only have these kind of free market effects. You know, there's like Econ 101 diagram where I have like a supply curve of dispute resolution and a demand curve for dispute resolution. And I want this sort of like ideal equilibrium where the curves intersect that's going to like maximize sort of global utility. You also have this like supply of dishonest dispute resolution. These people that are like willing to attack the system. And you can imagine that like if you just naively implement your sort of free market system, you'll wind up at the lower right equilibrium where most of your dispute resolvers are attackers. So like we've added constraints to the sort of world of free market, you know, kind of solutions, where it's not just a matter of like letting the markets move freely. You also have to worry about being attack resistant. That's something you need to like, you know, build in so that you have good outcomes. So what are some tools we have to parameterize cryptoeconomic systems, Kleros and others? How to make sure that we're at the like upper, you know, like intersection and not one of the intersections in the lower right? So a tool that we've used that, you know, for Kleros parameters is like we built a calculator that I sort of wrote in this Google Colab sheet. It takes in a few inputs and outputs parameters that satisfy a number of constraints. So what kinds of constraints? So just like an example, you want jurors who vote randomly to lose money on average. That's one of the constraints in the calculator. So jurors, you know, like they could vote randomly. Maybe they noticed that the freelancers are winning 80% of the freelancer small business disputes. So they just always vote for the freelancer because that wins more often than not. You know, like just strategies for the jurors that don't take into account like the individual facts of an individual case, we consider lazy strategies, and they should all lose money. And our sort of main tools to disincentivize lazy strategies are parameters, the arbitration fees that are paid to the jurors, and these deposits that they can lose if they vote poorly. And then you want to tune them somehow in such a way so that like honest participants gain money on average. If I'm like looking at the case and really making an effort to review the evidence, I should gain money on average, but like a lazy participant who's voting randomly or something should lose money on average. And how does the calculator do that? Well, it has some inputs that have to, for example, like the rate of success of lazy voting. So like how might one determine what that is? Well, like it's not, you know, it seems like relatively straightforward to pick out. If I just picked a random option, well, then my odds of success would be 1 over the number of options. This is the like more sophisticated lazy strategy where I always vote for the most common winning option. Well, that would give me the rate of success of that option. So if like the freelancer always wins with 80% of the time, you know, then my rate of success of just always voting for freelancer is 80%. So that's pretty objective, pretty straightforward. I can sort of like read that off the chain if I can't just reason it out theoretically. Like similarly, you want the rate of success if you vote honestly. So you can argue that should be greater than the overall rate of agreement of like users with the sort of with the collective answers, the rate at which people win like the dispute resolution game. Well, why? Well, not everyone is necessarily participating honestly, but you think, heuristically at least, that the people who are participating dishonestly are going to have a lower rate of agreeing with the community than the people who are participating honestly. So if you like look at sort of like the statistics we have on overall rate of agreement with the community, and you take out the dishonest people, like the people who are actually participating honestly should be even higher than the overall rate of agreement with the community. And that's something that you can like really straightforwardly read off of like a blockchain analytics tool. And then you're like, okay, what other inputs do I need? Well, I need some notion of how hard the task is. If my task takes hours of effort by some specialized person, that should pay differently than if it's something that someone could do in 5 minutes while riding a bus. And so how can we get these estimates of effort? Well, unlike the sort of previous 2 slides, where you can really readily read off information on chain about like what your input to the calculator should be, here, this is something that's really subjective. Like, you really need input from the jurors themselves. How hard is this task? And in practice, in Kleros, what we wind up doing is, you know, like when parameters are put to the forum, people debate whether their estimates are reasonable. When I get feedback on Telegram, sometimes I propose things, or other people propose things in the forum. And I get people, yelling on Telegram that the estimates are unreasonable. And even note that this diagram here, which is implicitly being used by the calculator in its sort of constraints, where people make a certain effort and then they have a probability P of being successful that corresponds to an honest strategy. And if they make less than that effort, they have a probability of T, which is sort of if they voted randomly, is already a really real simplification of how one models users' effort. In reality, they have this smooth curve, whereas there's not a fixed cutoff for how hard something is. They make a little bit of effort, their odds improve. They make a little more effort, their odds improve. Until eventually, if they spend hours poring over a test, their sort of odds of getting the right answer to kind of level off. And this, in reality, the sort of information you want about the efforts that your users are making is a curve like this for every single juror in the system. So that's a lot of really nuanced information that is hard to pick out even from people actively engaging in governance proposals and on Telegram. And it sort of highlights what one loses from being able to go by a pure free market approach, because in the sort of the magic of free markets is that people were submitting the prices they're willing to do dispute resolution work at. All of this information about the curves of different users is captured by that in a way that this sort of collective voting on a given price captures in a less finely grained fashion. Okay, so just some other tools people use to propose cryptoeconomic parameters. A lot of other platforms use something called agent-based modeling. So particularly in DeFi protocols, Gauntlet is a group that proposes parameters for protocols such as Aave and Compound. And then the idea here is that you have a bunch of personas that have some coded way they act. So maybe my risk-averse borrower, so this is in a computer simulation, and that the user in that simulation is coded in such a way that if their risk ever goes above some threshold, maybe they just close their position. If it's some moderate level of risk, then they add collateral, and rules for how they interact with the world around them, the simulated world around them. And then when you're running simulations, you pick some values of sort of global values, ether prices, gas costs. Maybe those evolved by some kind of Brownian motion. Maybe there's some trend or tendency. But they can also be affected by what the simulator's actors are doing. So if my simulated actors all have their positions liquidated and sell a bunch of ETH, maybe the ETH price in my model plunges. And the population of the simulated actors can evolve over time. Maybe all the risk-averse people leave because there's too much risk. And then the population of actors is all the risk-loving people. And these tools are really useful for picking out global outcomes. They can pick out feedback loops. Maybe it's okay, if all of the people are selling ETH because they're being liquidated, because the price of ETH went down, so people are being liquidated, so more ETH is being sold, so the price of ETH goes down. This is a feedback loop. It's maybe not so hard to reason out theoretically. But if you have more complicated feedback loops, might be able to pick them out from the model without having to coming up with a theoretical argument to be oh, there's this danger here. Okay, so just to conclude, you want to have, when you want to parameterize your cryptoeconomic systems, the ideal is to not have parameters at all. That would be the goal. However, that can be problematic in that if you just want to redeploy a new contract every time you have some new choice of values in your system, that doesn't work very well if you have network effects, and most platforms that we have network effects of some kind. If you want to have things that automatically adjust to the free market, you have to worry about constraints related to attack resistance that aren't present in a lot of sort of traditional systems where you just have some external actor who can punish people. The attack resistance has to be built into the system. And then in you have to, if you have a governance proposal system where people update the parameters based on some kind of voting, how does the model for hijacking the governance compare to the model for attacking the system itself? And then we have these different tools that we can use to try to come up with good parameters that pushes towards the attack-resistant equilibria. So these sort of calculators that that we use with Kleros, where you can program a bunch of rigid constraints, are useful tools for members of the community that are trying to input information about the prices they're willing to work at. Maybe they don't understand all of the constraints in the parameter, but they can still express some price information by putting in estimates into a calculator and outputting a set of like attack-resistant parameters that were compatible with their estimates. So this gives you some way of people having like being able to get accessible inputs into what parameters should be that would agree with what they think their like level of work is, or whatever other subjective estimates you have. And then you also have like agent-based modeling. You can use both like approaches sort of simultaneously. And this is particularly important, like useful whenever you have any kind of system that's like chaotic, that interacts with itself in like really complicated and chaotic ways, like in the chaos theory sense, because you can pick out feedback loops and sort of black swan events. Okay, so that's all. I'd be happy to take any questions if there's time. Great. Okay. Sorry. Or not. Cool.
Hey, thank you. Very interesting. Is it possible that some voters are given more weight than others? So, like, you could have experts in the field who are, say, 10 times more powerful than a regular voter.
In the governance proposal or in Kleros?
In Kleros.
Yeah, so currently we don't weight voters like that. However, that's an active research, so like subject of research, and that we're considering like expertise as indicated by soulbound tokens. So if you can somehow prove to the decentralized system that you're an expert, maybe you like submit yourself to a curated list, maybe Kleros itself like judges whether you have the expertise you claim to have, maybe you have a credential from some like external system. That could be used in such a way that you're like people are weighted differently and have like, for example, a higher chance of being drawn. Maybe you need this like expertise badge to be drawn in certain kinds of disputes. So like approaches like that are becoming more possible as people sort of innovate on kind of like social layers, decentralized society kind of ideas. Thank you. Yeah, so thanks everybody.